The runaway horse tore through Fox Basin's main street at a dead gallop, eyes white with terror, reins dragging through the dust. Grace Caldwell dropped the crate of linens she'd been loading and ran without thought, her heart hammering as the mare barreled straight toward the cluster of children outside the general store. She grabbed the hitching post and swung herself into the street, arms wide, voice rising in a sharp command that cut through the chaos. The mare's hooves threw dirt as it tried to veer, stumbled, and Grace lunged for the trailing reins. Her fingers closed around leather, just as a man in a brown duster materialized beside her, his hand clamping over hers, steadying the grip that kept the animal from bolting again. The mare reared once, nostrils flaring, then settled under their combined weight and calm voices. Grace's breath came hard as she turned to thank her unexpected partner, and found herself staring into eyes the color of storm-lit amber, set in a face she'd spent 2 years trying to forget. Eli Rollins let go of the reins first, stepping back as if the contact burned. "I didn't know you were still here," he said quietly, his voice rough with something Grace couldn't name. She handed the mare off to the livery boy who came running and brushed dust from her skirt with shaking hands. "I didn't know you'd come back," she replied, keeping her tone flat. The children were safe. The street was already returning to its afternoon rhythm, but her pulse refused to slow, and she knew it had nothing to do with the runaway horse. Eli shifted his weight, hat shadowing his face. "I heard you bought the old Willow Ranch," he said. "Heard you're making it work." Grace met his eyes and saw the unspoken question beneath the casual words. "I'm trying," she said. Then she walked away, before he could see the way her hands trembled, before the town gossips could add fuel to the fire that had driven her out of her last home 2 years ago. The bank letter arrived the next morning, crisp and cold as a knife blade. Grace read it twice in the dim light of the ranch house kitchen, the words blurring together into a single threat. Payment overdue. Foreclosure proceedings. 30 days. She set the letter down carefully and stared at the empty coffee cup in front of her, mind racing through calculations that refused to balance. The cattle sale would cover half. The guest fees from travelers staying at the inn she ran out of the main house might stretch another quarter. But the rest, she had no answer for the rest. She heard boots on the porch and turned to see her hired hand, old Samuel, shaking his head before he even spoke. "That fence didn't fall on its own, Miss Grace," he said. "Someone cut the wire clean through. Took a dozen head through the gap before I found it." Grace felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. The missing cattle weren't just a loss. They were the difference between survival and ruin. She rode into town that afternoon with her ledger and her pride both wearing thin. The bank manager listened to her plea with the expression of a man watching a bug drown in his coffee. "I'm sorry, Miss Caldwell," he said, not sounding sorry at all. "But the board has concerns about your, shall we say, reputation." Grace's jaw tightened. "My reputation has nothing to do with my ability to run a ranch," she said evenly. The manager shrugged. "In a town like Fox Basin, reputation is collateral," he replied. "Unless you can find a partner with a cleaner name, I'm afraid the answer is no." Grace stood, gathering her ledger with hands that wanted to shake. She would not give him the satisfaction. She walked out into the afternoon sun and nearly collided with Eli Rollins on the boardwalk. He steadied her with a hand on her elbow, then dropped it quickly when she stiffened. "You look like you just got bad news," he said. Grace forced a tight smile. Just the usual, she replied. Trying to keep a ranch running when half the town thinks I'm cursed. Eli's expression flickered with something that might have been sympathy or guilt. She couldn't tell which, and didn't want to know. They stood in silence for a moment, the town moving around them like a river around stones. Then Eli spoke again, his voice lower. I heard about the fence, he said, and the bank pressure. Grace's head snapped up. This town talks too much, she said sharply. Eli's mouth twitched, almost a smile. Always has, he agreed. He hesitated, then continued. I'm looking for a place to stable my horses. Somewhere quiet where I can work them without the whole town watching. I'd pay fair rent. Grace stared at him, suspicion rising hot and immediate. I don't need charity, she said. Eli's eyes hardened. I'm not offering charity, he replied. I'm offering business. You've got the space and the privacy I need. I've got cash you need. Simple transaction. Grace wanted to refuse. Wanted to tell him to take his guilt and his money and ride back out of Fox Basin the way he'd ridden out 2 years ago without a word. But the bank letter was still folded in her pocket, and 30 days was not enough time to be proud. Fine, she said curtly. But you stable your horses, pay your rent, and stay out of my way. Eli nodded slowly. Agreed, he said. Then he tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Grace standing alone on the boardwalk, wondering if she'd just made the worst mistake of her life. Eli rode out to Willow Ranch the next morning, with 3 horses and a wagon load of tack. Grace met him at the barn, arms crossed, expression carefully neutral. Samuel showed him the empty stalls and the water troughs, and Eli worked quietly, settling his animals with the ease of a man who knew horses better than people. Grace watched from the barn door, telling herself she was just making sure he kept his end of the bargain. But her eyes kept drifting to the way he moved, deliberate and calm, the way he spoke low to the horses, the way sunlight caught in his hair when he stepped into the open doorway. He looked up and caught her staring. She turned away quickly, heat rising in her cheeks, and walked back toward the house with her spine rigid. Behind her, she heard the soft sound that might have been a laugh, and it made her furious in a way she didn't want to examine. That night, one of her guest horses went lame. Grace found the animal favoring its front leg in the small corral behind the inn, and her heart sank. A traveling merchant had paid in advance for the horse's care, and if she couldn't deliver, her reputation would take another blow she couldn't afford. She was crouched beside the horse, running careful hands down the leg, when Eli appeared at the fence. Need help? He asked. Grace didn't look up. I can handle it, she said. Eli vaulted the fence and came to stand beside her anyway. Looks like a stone bruise, he said after a moment, his voice clinically detached. Needs rest and a poultice. I've got comfrey and arnica in my saddlebag. Grace straightened, irritation flaring. I know what it needs, she said. Eli held up his hands in surrender. I'm sure you do, he said mildly. But 2 sets of hands work faster than one. And that merchant's expecting to leave at dawn. Grace wanted to argue, wanted to send him away. But the horse was suffering, and dawn was only a few hours off, and pride was a luxury she couldn't afford tonight. Fine, she said tightly. Let's get to work. They worked in silence, Grace mixing the poultice, while Eli held the horse steady, their shoulders nearly touching in the close confines of the stall. The lantern light turned everything gold and soft, and Grace found herself hyper-aware of every breath, every accidental brush of his arm against hers. When the poultice was set and wrapped, Eli straightened and met her eyes. "You're good at this," he said quietly. Grace shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "I've had practice," she replied. Eli's expression shifted, something complicated moving behind his eyes. "Grace," he started, then stopped. She waited, heart hammering, but he just shook his head. "Never mind," he said. "Get some rest. I'll check on him before I leave in the morning." Grace nodded, not trusting her voice, and watched him walk out into the night. She stood alone in the barn for a long time after, the warmth of his presence still lingering like smoke. The trouble started 3 days later, when the supply wagon didn't arrive. Grace waited at the crossroads until sunset, worry coiling tighter with every passing hour. When she finally rode back to the ranch, she found Samuel waiting with grim news. "Found the wagon 2 miles out, Miss Grace," he said. "Driver's unhurt, but the cargo's scattered across half the valley. Looks like the axle was tampered with." Grace felt the ground shift beneath her feet. The supplies were already paid for, goods she needed to keep the inn running and the ranch operational. If she couldn't deliver meals to her guests or feed her stock, word would spread, and her fragile reputation would shatter completely. She rode out at first light with Samuel and Eli, who'd insisted on coming despite her protests. The scene was worse than she'd imagined. Crates lay broken and scattered, flour and grain soaking into the dirt, fabric torn and trampled. The driver sat on a rock, head in his hands. "I'm sorry, Miss Caldwell," he said miserably. "I checked that axle myself the night before. I swear it was sound." Grace crouched beside the broken wheel and saw the clean cut hidden beneath the splintered wood. "This wasn't an accident," she said quietly. "Someone wanted this to happen." Eli knelt beside her, his face hard. "You've got enemies," he said bluntly. Grace laughed, a bitter sound. "I've got a whole town full of people who think I'm bad luck," she replied. "That narrows it down." Eli's jaw tightened. "This isn't bad luck, Grace," he said. "This is sabotage. Someone's trying to ruin you, and they're not being subtle about it." Grace stood, brushing dirt from her skirt, refusing to let the fear show. "Then I'll have to be less subtle about fighting back," she said. But even as she spoke, she felt the walls closing in. The bank deadline was 2 weeks away. Her supplies were destroyed. Her reputation was hanging by a thread. And the one man who seemed willing to help was the same man who'd broken her heart and left without explanation 2 years ago. They salvaged what they could and hauled it back to the ranch in silence. Grace spent the afternoon calculating losses and trying to source replacement supplies she couldn't afford. When Eli found her in the ranch office that evening, bent over her ledger with her head in her hands, he didn't ask permission before sitting down across from her. "Tell me about the scandal," he said quietly. Grace's head snapped up. "That's none of your business," she said sharply. Eli leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "If someone's using it to destroy you, it is my business," he replied. Grace stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "You left, Eli," she said, her voice tight with old anger. "You left Fox Basin 2 years ago without a word, and you don't get to come back now and pretend you care about my problems." Eli was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice low and raw. "I left because I cared too much," he he said. Grace turned slowly, heart pounding. What? She whispered. Eli stood, his hands flexing at his sides. I was in too deep, Grace, he said. The gambling, the drinking, the fights. I was drowning, and I knew if I stayed, I'd drag you down with me. So I left. Went east, worked on a ranch, got clean. But I thought about you every damn day. Grace stared at him, 1,000 questions tangling on her tongue. Then why didn't you write? She asked, her voice breaking. Why didn't you tell me? Eli's expression twisted with something that looked like shame. Because I didn't think I deserved you, he said simply. And I still don't. But I'm here now, and I'm not leaving until I know you're safe. Grace felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. I don't need you to save me, she said. Eli nodded slowly. I know, he replied, but maybe I need to try anyway. The silence between them stretched taut and fragile, filled with everything they hadn't said, and everything they still couldn't. The water rights meeting happened 2 days later in the town hall, and Grace walked in, knowing she was walking into a fight. The ranchers upstream had been diverting more than their share all summer, and Willow Ranch's creek was running dangerously low. Grace took her seat in the back and tried to ignore the whispers that followed her entrance. Eli slipped in beside her without asking, his presence solid and steady at her shoulder. When Thomas Garrett stood to speak, his voice boomed through the hall with the confidence of a man who'd never been questioned. The upstream ranches need that water for our herds, he declared. We can't be expected to sacrifice our livelihoods for. He paused, his eyes finding Grace in the crowd, less established operations. Grace felt the words land like a slap, but she stood anyway, her voice clear and firm. The water rights were drawn up fair, she said. If you take more than your share, you're stealing, and theft is theft, no matter how you dress it up. The room erupted in murmurs, some supportive, most hostile. Garrett's face darkened. Careful, Miss Caldwell, he said coldly. Accusations like that can be dangerous for someone in your position. Grace felt Eli tense beside her, but she kept her eyes on Garrett. Is that a threat? She asked quietly. Garrett smiled, a thin, cruel expression. Just friendly advice, he replied. After all, we wouldn't want any more unfortunate accidents to befall Willow Ranch. The room went silent. Grace's hands clenched into fists at her sides. But before she could respond, Eli stood. That sounded a lot like a confession, he said, his voice dangerously soft. Garrett's eyes narrowed. You need to learn when to keep your mouth shut, Rollins, he said. Eli smiled, and it wasn't friendly. I've learned a lot of things, he replied, including how to recognize a bully when I see one. The tension in the room ratcheted up like a drawn bowstring. Grace touched Eli's arm, a warning, and he subsided slightly, though his eyes never left Garrett's face. The meeting dissolved into arguments and shouting, and Grace left with the sick certainty that she'd just made a powerful enemy, even more determined to destroy her. They walked back toward the livery in tense silence, the evening air heavy with the promise of rain. Grace finally spoke when they were out of earshot of the dispersing crowd. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly. Eli glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Yes, I did, he replied. Grace stopped walking, forcing him to turn and face her. Why? She asked. the question carrying more weight than the single word. Why are you really here, Eli? What do you want from me? Eli was silent for a long moment, his eyes searching her face in the fading light. I want a chance to be the man I should have been 2 years ago, he said finally. I want to prove I'm not the wreck who left you. And I want... He stopped, his voice dropping lower. I want you to look at me the way you used to. Before I ruined everything. Grace's breath caught, her heart hammering against her ribs. And what if I can't? She whispered. What if that trust is just gone? Eli's expression twisted with something that looked like pain. Then I'll have to earn it back, he said. However long it takes. The storm hit that night with brutal force, rain hammering the ranch house roof and wind tearing at the shutters. Grace woke to the sound of splintering wood and Samuel's panicked shout. She threw on a coat over her nightdress and ran out into the deluge. The barn's roof had partially collapsed, and the horses were screaming in terror, trapped in their stalls beneath the wreckage. Grace didn't think. She plunged into the chaos, rain blinding her, and started pulling at the broken beams. Eli appeared beside her like a ghost, his face set and grim, and together they fought to free the animals. A beam gave way with a shriek of nails, and Grace lunged to grab the halter of the nearest horse, just as the rest of the roof began to sag. Eli's arm wrapped around her waist and hauled her backward as timber crashed down where she'd been standing. They fell together in the mud, the horse bolting to safety, and for a moment Grace could only lie there gasping, her heart pounding, Eli's body solid and warm against hers, despite the freezing rain. He pulled her up roughly, his hands gripping her shoulders. Are you insane? He shouted over the storm. You could have been killed. Grace shoved his hands away, fury and adrenaline making her reckless. Those horses are all I have left, she shouted back. I'm not letting them die. Eli's face was a mask of frustration and fear. You're no good to them dead, he yelled. Grace turned away, but he caught her arm, spinning her back. Listen to me, he said, his voice raw. You can't save everything by throwing yourself in front of it. Sometimes you have to let someone help. Grace stared up at him, rain streaming down her face, and something inside her cracked. I don't know how, she whispered, the words barely audible over the storm. I don't know how to let anyone in anymore. Eli's expression softened, and he pulled her against his chest, his arms wrapping tight around her. Then let me teach you, he said into her hair. Let me prove you can trust me. Grace closed her eyes and let herself lean into his warmth for just one moment, pretending she could believe him. They worked through the night salvaging what they could and moving the surviving animals to the small stable near the house. By dawn, Grace was exhausted, soaked, and facing the stark reality that she'd just lost half her barn and any chance of making the bank payment. She sat on the porch steps as the rain eased to a drizzle, staring at the wreckage, and felt the weight of defeat pressing down on her shoulders. Eli sat down beside her, his presence quiet and steady. We'll rebuild, he said. Grace laughed, a hollow sound. With what money? She asked. I've got 9 days until the bank forecloses, and I just lost my barn. It's over, Eli. Eli was silent for a moment. Then he spoke carefully. I have money, he said, from the ranch work I did back east. It's yours if you need it. Grace turned to stare at him, shocked. I can't take your money, she said. Eli met her eyes steadily. It's not charity, he said. It's an investment. In the ranch. In you. In us. If you'll let there be an us. Grace's throat tightened, tears threatening again. Why? She whispered. Why would you risk everything for me? Eli reached out slowly and tucked a wet strand of hair behind her ear, his touch unbearably gentle. Because you're worth it, he said simply. Because you always have been. And I'm tired of being a coward. Grace wanted to believe him, wanted to let herself fall into the warmth in his eyes and trust that this time he wouldn't leave. But fear held her frozen, the old wound of his abandonment still too raw. I need time, she said finally. Eli nodded, his hand dropping away. I'm not going anywhere, he said. Take all the time you need. They sat in silence as the sun broke through the clouds, painting the devastated ranch in shades of gold and hope that felt cruelly ironic. Grace didn't know if she could trust him, but she knew she couldn't do this alone anymore. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start. The next blow came 2 days later, when Marshal Briggs rode up to the ranch with a warrant. Grace was in the kitchen when she heard the horses, and something about the heavy official sound of the hoofbeats made her stomach drop. She walked out onto the porch and saw the marshal's face, grim and uncomfortable. Miss Caldwell, he said, tipping his hat. I'm here on official business. Grace's hands tightened on the porch rail. What kind of business? She asked, keeping her voice steady. The marshal pulled a folded paper from his coat. There's been a complaint filed, he said, concerning the death of Jacob Hartley 5 years ago. Grace felt the world tilt. Jacob Hartley had been a ranch hand who died in an accident, crushed when a wagon overturned. It had been ruled accidental, and Grace had been nowhere near when it happened. What complaint? She asked, her voice thin. The marshal's expression was pained. Thomas Garrett's filed a statement saying he has new evidence that the accident was caused by negligence on your part, he said. Possibly even deliberate action. Grace's vision swam. That's insane, she said. I wasn't even there. I was in town that day. Dozens of people saw me. The marshal nodded. I believe you, Miss Caldwell, he said. But the law requires an investigation. I'm going to need you to come into town and answer some questions. Grace felt panic rising, cold and sharp. When? She asked. Now, the marshal said gently. I'm sorry. Grace heard boots on the porch boards and turned to see Eli, his face hard as stone. This is Garrett's doing, he said flatly. He's trying to destroy her because she stood up to him. The marshal sighed. That may be, he said. But I still have to follow procedure. Eli's jaw clenched. Then I'm coming with her, he said. The marshal nodded. Suit yourself, he replied. Grace walked inside on numb legs to change into clean clothes, her mind spinning. Garrett was using the one tragedy she'd never been able to escape. The accident that had happened on land she'd been managing, even though she'd been miles away when it occurred. The town had whispered about it for months, and even after the inquest cleared her, the stain had remained. It was why she'd left her previous town. Why she'd come to Fox Basin hoping for a fresh start. And now, Garrett was weaponizing it to finish what the sabotage had started. The interrogation lasted hours. Grace answered every question with as much calm as she could muster, repeating the same facts over and over. She'd been in town. She had witnesses. The wagon had been inspected and found faulty. Jacob Hartley's death had been a tragic accident, nothing more. But she could see the doubt in the deputy's eyes, could feel the weight of the town's judgment pressing in through the jailhouse walls. When they finally let her go with a warning not to leave Fox Basin, Grace walked out into the evening air, feeling like she'd been beaten. Eli was waiting, leaning against the hitching post, and the relief on his face when he saw her was almost painful. "They didn't charge you," he said. Grace shook her head. "Not yet," she replied. "But they will if Garrett has his way." Eli's hands curled into fists. "We need to prove he's lying," he said. "We need evidence." Grace laughed bitterly. "Evidence of what?" she asked. "That a powerful man is willing to ruin someone weaker to get what he wants? That's not a crime, Eli. That's just how the world works." Eli caught her shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. "The world doesn't have to work like that," he said fiercely. "Not if we fight back." Grace felt something crack inside her, exhaustion and fear and old hurt pouring out. "I'm tired of fighting," she whispered. "I'm so tired, Eli. Maybe I should just let it all go. Sell the ranch, leave Fox Basin, start over somewhere else." Eli's grip tightened. "And let Garrett win?" he asked. "Let him destroy you and move on to his next victim?" Grace pulled away, wrapping her arms around herself. "What choice do I have?" she asked. "I'm out of money, out of time, and out of allies." Eli stepped closer, his voice dropping low and urgent. "You have me," he said. "You have me, Grace. And I'm not letting you give up. Not when we're this close." Grace looked up at him, searching his face for doubt or pity and finding only fierce determination. "Why does this matter so much to you?" she asked. Eli's expression softened. "Because you matter to me," he said simply. "Because watching you fight has reminded me what courage looks like. And because I love you, Grace. I've loved you since the day you told off the mayor for shortchanging the school teacher. And I never stopped." Grace's breath caught, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. The words hung between them, raw and honest and terrifying. "Eli," she started, but he shook his head. "You don't have to say it back," he said quickly. "I just needed you to know. I needed you to understand why I'm not walking away." Grace felt tears spill over, hot against her cold cheeks. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I'm scared of trusting you and losing you again." Eli reached out slowly and cupped her face in his hands, his touch achingly gentle. "Then don't trust me yet," he said. "Just let me stand beside you. Let me help you fight. And when this is over, if you still want me to leave, I will. But I'm not abandoning you now." Grace closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, and made a choice that felt like stepping off a cliff. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." Eli's forehead pressed against hers, and for a moment, they just stood there, breathing together in the gathering dark, the town's noise fading around them. The break came from an unlikely source. Sarah Mitchell, a widow who ran the boarding house, appeared at Willow Ranch the next morning with a worn ledger tucked under her arm. "Miss Caldwell," she said without preamble, "I need to show you something." Grace invited her in, and Sarah spread the ledger on the kitchen table. "This belonged to my late husband," she explained. "He did bookkeeping for several of the ranches, including Garrett's. I found it when I was cleaning out the attic last week." Grace leaned over the pages, squinting at the cramped handwriting. "What am I looking at?" she asked. Sarah pointed to a series of entries from 5 years ago. "Payments to Jacob Hartley," she said. "Large ones, made by Garrett. And look at the dates. They stopped 2 weeks before Hartley died." Grace's pulse quickened. "Why would Garrett be paying my ranch hand?" she asked. Sarah's expression was grim. "I think Hartley was working for Garrett," she said. "I think he was sabotaging your operation. And when he got caught or had second thoughts, Garrett cut him off." Grace stared at the ledger, her mind racing. "And the wagon accident," she said slowly. "What if it wasn't an accident at all? What if Garrett arranged it to silence Hartley?" Sarah nodded. "That's what I think," she said. "And I think Garrett's been terrified for 5 years that someone would figure it out. That's why he's so determined to destroy you now. You're the only person who could connect the dots." Eli had been listening from the doorway, and now he stepped forward. "This is evidence," he said. "Real evidence. We can take this to the marshal." Sarah shook her head. "It's not enough," she said. "It's circumstantial. We need proof that Garrett was behind the sabotage, and we need a witness." Grace's mind worked furiously. "The wagon driver," she said suddenly. "The one from the supply run. He said he checked the axle the night before. What if someone paid him to look the other way?" Eli's eyes lit up. "Or threatened him," he said. "Either way, he might talk if we push." Grace grabbed her coat. "Then let's go find him," she said. But when they reached the driver's boarding house, they found his room empty, his belongings gone. The landlord shrugged. "He cleared out 2 nights ago," he said. "Paid up and left without a word." Grace felt hope slipping away again. "Garrett got to him," she said flatly. "He's covering his tracks." Eli's jaw set. "Then we push harder," he said. "We make Garrett nervous. Make him sloppy." Grace looked at him, fear and determination warring in her chest. "How?" she asked. Eli's smile was sharp and dangerous. "We call him out," he said. "Publicly. Make him defend himself in front of the whole town." Grace's breath caught. "That's risky," she said. "If it doesn't work, I'll be ruined." Eli met her eyes steadily. "And if we don't try, you're ruined anyway," he said. "At least this way we go down fighting." They organized a town meeting for the following evening, and word spread fast. By the time Grace and Eli arrived at the town hall, it was packed, the air thick with anticipation and hostile curiosity. Thomas Garrett sat in the front row with his allies, his expression smug and confident. Grace's hands shook as she stood to speak, but Eli's presence at her back steadied her. She laid out everything: the sabotaged fence, the destroyed supply wagon, the accusations about Jacob Hartley's death. And then she presented Sarah's ledger, reading the entries aloud in a voice that grew stronger with every word. "Thomas Garrett was paying Jacob Hartley," she said clearly. "Large sums, right up until 2 weeks before Hartley died. Why would a man pay another man's employee unless he was buying sabotage?" The room erupted in murmurs. Garrett stood, his face dark with fury. "That's slander," he shouted. "You have no proof." Grace met his eyes without flinching. "Then explain the payments," she said. "Explain why you filed false accusations against me the day after I challenged you at the water rights meeting. Explain why the wagon driver who witnessed the sabotage on my supply run disappeared the moment you realized I was getting close to the truth." Garrett's composure cracked, rage flashing across his face. "You're finished, Caldwell," he snarled. "I'll see you hang for Hartley's death." The words hung in the shocked silence, and Grace saw her opening. "So you admit there's a connection between you and Hartley's death?" she asked quietly. Garrett realized his mistake too late. His mouth opened, closed. "That's not what I said," he blustered. But the room had turned, the crowd's mood shifting. People were whispering, doubt creeping into expressions that had been certain moments before. The marshal stood from his seat in the back. "Mr. Garrett," he said heavily, "I think we need to have a conversation." Garrett's face went pale. "This is a witch hunt," he said. "Rollins and Caldwell are in this together. They're trying to frame me." Eli stepped forward, his voice cold and clear. "If that's true, then you should welcome an investigation," he said, "unless you have something to hide." The marshal moved toward Garrett, and the crowd parted. Garrett looked around wildly, seeing his allies melting away, and then he bolted for the door. Eli was moving before Grace could react, plunging through the crowd after Garrett. Grace followed, her heart in her throat, and burst out onto the dark street to see Garrett mounting his horse. Eli grabbed the reins, and Garrett lashed out with his boot, catching Eli in the shoulder. Eli staggered but held on. "You're not running," he said through gritted teeth. "Not this time." Garrett drew a pistol, and Grace screamed. The marshal shouted from the doorway, but everything was happening too fast. Garrett aimed at Eli's chest, and Grace didn't think. She grabbed a loose board from the construction pile beside the hall and swung it hard into Garrett's arm. The gun went off with a deafening crack, the bullet burying itself in the dirt, and Garrett toppled from his horse. The marshal and his deputies swarmed forward, wrestling Garrett to the ground. Grace dropped the board, her whole body shaking, and turned to find Eli staring at her with wide eyes. "You just saved my life," he said, sounding dazed. Grace let out a shaky laugh. "I guess that makes us even," she replied. Eli crossed the distance between them in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. "Don't ever do that again," he said into her hair. Grace wrapped her arms around him and held on just as tightly. "I can't promise that," she whispered, "but I'll try." Garrett was taken into custody that night, and by morning, his hired men were talking, desperate to save themselves. The full picture emerged piece by piece. Garrett had been buying up water rights and land for years, using intimidation and sabotage to drive out anyone who resisted. Jacob Hartley had been on his payroll, but when Hartley developed a conscience and threatened to expose Garrett, Garrett had arranged the wagon accident that killed him. For 5 years, Garrett had lived in fear that someone would discover the truth. And when Grace started asking questions and standing up to him, he decided to eliminate the threat permanently. The charges were serious enough that Garrett wouldn't see freedom for a very long time, and the water rights were redistributed fairly. Grace's name was cleared completely, the cloud of suspicion finally lifting. The bank, embarrassed by their role in pressuring her, extended her loan at better terms. And slowly, cautiously, Fox Basin began to treat Grace like a person instead of a pariah. Willow Ranch started to heal. With Eli's help and the money he insisted on investing, they rebuilt the barn stronger than before. Guests began returning to the inn, drawn by word of mouth that spoke of honest hospitality and good care. The cattle herd grew, the creek ran clear, and every day, Grace found herself working side by side with Eli. Their partnership, deepening into something neither of them could deny. But Eli still kept his distance at night, still slept in the bunkhouse with Samuel, still treated Grace with a careful respect that was starting to drive her mad. One evening, as they finished repairing a fence line and the sun painted the valley gold, Grace finally confronted him. "Are you ever going to kiss me?" she asked bluntly. Eli froze, his hand stilling on the wire he'd been twisting. "What?" he asked, his voice rough. Grace turned to face him fully. "You said you loved me," she said. "You've stood by me through everything. You've rebuilt my barn, saved my ranch, and nearly gotten shot for me. But you haven't so much as held my hand unless we were in danger. So I'm asking, are you ever going to kiss me? Or are you planning to be a gentleman forever?" Eli dropped the wire and closed the distance between them in one stride. "I've been trying to do this right," he said, his voice low and intense. "Trying to prove I'm not the man who left you. Trying to earn your trust before I asked for anything more." Grace reached up and gripped his vest, pulling him closer. "You've already earned it," she said, "and I'm tired of waiting." Eli's hands came up to frame her face, his touch reverent. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Because once I start, Grace, I'm not stopping. I'm not leaving. I'm here for good." Grace smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Then stop talking," she whispered, "and kiss me." Eli's mouth came down on hers with a hunger that stole her breath. And Grace melted into him, her hands fisting in his vest, as the world narrowed to just the two of them. The kiss was everything, apology and promise and desperate need. And when they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Grace laughed shakily. "That was worth waiting for," she said. Eli rested his forehead against hers, his hands sliding into her hair. "I love you," he said again, the words easier this time. "I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving it." Grace's eyes stung with happy tears. "I love you too," she whispered. "And I'm ready to stop running. I'm ready to build something real." Eli kissed her again, slower this time. And Grace knew with bone-deep certainty that this was the beginning of everything she'd been afraid to hope for. The wedding happened 2 months later in front of the rebuilt barn, with the whole town invited. Grace wore a simple cream dress with lace at the collar, her hair loose and crowned with wildflowers Sarah had helped her gather. Eli wore his best vest and a new white shirt, his hair trimmed but still long enough to curl at his collar. And when he saw Grace walking toward him, his eyes shone with unshed tears. Samuel stood as witness, grinning so wide his face looked like it might crack. The minister from the church read the vows, and when Eli slid a simple gold band onto Grace's finger, she felt something inside her settle, a wounded place finally beginning to heal. They kissed to cheers and applause, and Grace laughed against Eli's mouth, dizzy with joy. The reception spilled across the ranch yard, tables laden with food the townspeople had brought, children running wild between the adults, music drifting from the fiddle player Samuel had hired. Grace danced with Eli under the lantern light, his arms strong and sure around her, and felt like she'd finally come home. "You're stuck with me now," she teased. Eli grinned, spinning her in a slow circle. "Best decision I ever made," he replied. That night, after the guests had gone and the ranch lay quiet under a blanket of stars, Grace and Eli stood on the porch of the house that was now fully theirs. Eli's arm was wrapped around her waist, and Grace leaned into his warmth, feeling peaceful for the first time in longer than she could remember. "Do you ever regret it?" Eli asked quietly. "Coming to Fox Basin, fighting so hard for this place?" Grace considered the question, thinking of the sabotage and the accusations, the fear and the exhaustion, and the moments when she'd wanted to give up. Then she thought of the ranch thriving, the community slowly warming to her, and the man beside her who'd proven his love in 1,000 quiet ways. "No," she said finally. "Not for a second. Because it brought me here. It brought me you." Eli kissed the top of her head. "I'm the lucky one," he said. "You taught me what it means to be brave." Grace turned in his arms, smiling up at him. "Then I guess we're both lucky," she said. Eli's answering smile was soft and full of promise. "Guess we are," he agreed. They stood there together as the night deepened. Two people who'd been lost and broken, finding their way to wholeness in each other. And the future stretched out before them like an open road. The years that followed were not without challenges, but they faced them together. Droughts came and were endured. Hard winters tested them. But Willow Ranch prospered, and the inn became known throughout the territory as a place of honest warmth. Grace's reputation transformed from cautionary tale to success story, and she became a quiet advocate for other women trying to carve out independence in the unforgiving West. Eli proved himself over and over, his steadiness and courage earning respect from even the hardest critics. They built a life of work and laughter, quiet evenings and shared dreams. And when their first child was born, a daughter with Grace's warm eyes and Eli's stubborn jaw, they named her Hope. Because that's what they'd found in each other, when everything else seemed lost. Hope that broken things could be mended. Hope that trust could be rebuilt. Hope that love, real love, was worth every risk and every fight. On a spring morning, 5 years after that desperate midnight ride, Grace stood in the same barn where Eli had first helped her with the injured horse, watching him gentle a skittish colt with patient hands. He looked up and caught her watching, and the smile he gave her was everything: warmth and contentment and deep abiding love. She crossed to him and slipped her hand into his, and he laced their fingers together without hesitation. "I was just thinking," she said quietly. "About what?" Eli asked. Grace leaned her head on his shoulder. "About how we almost missed this," she said. "How close I came to giving up, running away, never letting you back in." Eli kissed her temple. "But you didn't," he said. "You stayed. You fought. You chose to trust me." Grace smiled, peace settling over her like a benediction. "Best decision I ever made," she whispered, echoing his words from their wedding day. Eli's arm tightened around her. "Mine too," he said. "Mine too." They stood together in the quiet barn, the colt nosing at Eli's pocket for treats. Sunlight streaming through the open doors, and Grace knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The past, with all its pain and scandal, had led her here. To this man, this life, this love, and she wouldn't change a single step of the journey. The story of Grace Caldwell and Eli Rollins became legend in Fox Basin. People spoke of it on cold nights. The tale of the innkeeper who'd been accused, and the gambler who'd ridden to save her. The love that had grown from ashes and suspicion into something unshakable. Young couples looked to them as proof that second chances existed, that broken people could heal, that trust once shattered, could be carefully rebuilt into something even stronger. And Grace and Eli, for their part, simply kept living, kept working, kept choosing each other every single day. Because that, they'd learned, was what real love looked like. Not grand gestures or dramatic rescues, though those had their place, but the quiet daily choice to stand together, to forgive, to fight for what mattered, and to believe, even in the darkest moments, that dawn would come again. And it always did.